Neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Well, good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with me tonight Mr. Buck Melton Jr. Is that correct? Dr. Melton, thank you for coming.
Back again. Glad to be here.
You've been here a lot, and we've had different discussions centered on the Constitution and its guide for the American people in times of crisis and difficulties. And right now we have the issue with Syria and the appropriateness of the executive power to basically punish the Syrian government for their evil actions. Is there any kind of constitutional guidance on this? I mean, where do we stand with the Constitution?
Well, this is a fun topic. This is a fascinating standoff between president and legislature over the question of what is generically called the war power or the war powers.
Yes.
And the basic breakdown is in Article 2, which is the executive article. It notes that the president shall be commander-in-chief of the armed forces.
Yes.
And I will say that when that was first written, people had a very specific person in mind, George Washington,
yes,
whom had been the general-in-chief of the Continental Army and
yes,
whom they fully expected would be the first president.
Yes, yes.
So they were thinking in terms of field command and go out there
yes,
and take the field.
He was a real patriarch of the country.
Indeed.
I mean,
Indeed,
he was the father of the country. People thought of him that way. Yes,
he really was. Then on the congressional side, Article 1, the legislative branch, Article 1, Section 8, Congress has a group of powers to provide an army, to make appropriations for the army, to make appropriations for the Navy, to establish rules for discipline and conduct of the military forces, and of course, I think I mentioned the appropriation power, to tax and then to spend that money on the armed forces.
Yes.
So it's the power of the sword in the hands of the president and the power of the purse in the hands of Congress. So that's the classic division.
Yes, yes. And so can the executive, and have they done this in American history, just say, I'm going to attack somewhere, and maybe Jefferson with the Barbary pirates, he just did it without, so this is a normal part of our history. The executive just does things like that.
There are far more examples in terms of number, if not in size. There are far more examples of presidents just sending in the troops than there are of him either going to Congress or of Congress itself passing a war declaration, which is also in its power, and then telling the president to go do it.
Now, have there been situations where Congress just said, well, the president may have done this, but we're not going to pay for it? And I mean, has that ever happened?
Not to my knowledge, at least not on a large scale.
Yes.
And of course, that's the great, huge check that Congress can cut it off. There have been a lot of times when Congress has wanted to criticize the president without running the risk of losing the next election.
Yes.
So they make a lot of Sturm und Drang about the president's wrong to have done this, but they don't put their money where their mouth is. They don't cut off appropriations. It's much easier just to criticize.
Yes, and so that's been the way it's been. So looking at the president's ultimatum against the Syrian government, that seems pretty routine. I mean, there's nothing that's unconstitutional about it. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, on its face, yes. First of all, he's the commander-in-chief. Second of all, the president does take the lead in foreign policy by virtue of the fact that he appoints and receives ambassadors.
Yes.
So in either regard there, I think in general terms, he's on the line there.
Well, what is the cure, if I could ask this? If there's an executive that just uses these war powering acts against the will of the American people, and in some really heinous way, if I could say it that way. Maybe Syria, there's some justification for that. Suppose another president at another time decided to blow up Tijuana or something like that. I mean, could the president do almost anything he wanted and not face the power of Congress or the courts to stop him?
Well, this is where things get interesting and where we get away from the straight text of the Constitution. It's more a matter of politics than it is strictly of law. And I think that's how Obama has painted himself into a corner here, that he issued this ultimatum and talked about the red line, and then, being the internationalist that he is, he looked to the international community to back him, and the international community didn't. And so without that backing, he had to turn to the American people in the form of Congress. And now Congress and the people themselves are lacking the backing. And so he realizes he's in a tight spot. And the tight spot being that a president politically simply cannot commit to a war or combat or a strike that would be grossly unpopular. And this one certainly can.
Well, I want to keep looking at these bright red lines. So, Ken, and I'm wondering about the world situation, the way the world goes. And I'm going to talk about another president another time. We've got enormous weapons at the disposal of the executive. I mean, could the president just say, you know, these guys, I'm going to, there's an unpopular regime. Iran might be an example. Iran is really, they're not doing anything to us. Maybe they're going to get nuclear weapons. Maybe I don't like that. And I'm just going to hit them with nuclear weapons. I'm just going to do something horrific without any kind of congressional approval, without any international approval. I'm just going to do it. Maybe I had a bad day at the office. Is there any limitations on that? I mean, it seems to me, reading the Constitution, maybe go back to that. I mean, isn't it a little precise about how war is declared and what? Maybe we can move into the issue of a small regional conflict. I mean, okay, so Jefferson is going to punish the Barbary pirates. I've got it. Maybe it's okay to send some missiles into Sudan to hit a weapons factory or something. I mean, okay, well, they're going to blow people up here. I mean, we did something. It doesn't seem so alien to our history to do that. But what about a president that just arbitrarily really commits the country to a course that's unpopular and not sanctioned? And shouldn't Congress have the power to declare war then? What does the Constitution say about that?
Yes, and the power to actually declare war is in the hands of Congress, and that's one that I omitted to mention at the beginning. But the Constitution and international law both at least implicitly recognize that wars don't have to be declared to be actual. And as a matter of fact, the Supreme Court ruled on that during the undeclared naval war with France that happened just before the Barbary pilots. The court said, look, Congress has not declared this war, but it's still a war. And if Congress doesn't like it, Congress's answer is to either cut off appropriations or impeach the president. We are to the political stage with this. Keep in mind that the Constitution was written at a time when striking power, when the power of weapons was much more restricted, when time passed much more slowly. It took weeks to get across the Atlantic with diplomatic dispatches or military troops. No nuclear weapons, obviously. So it's not that the Constitution per se would not allow the president to carry out a unilateral nuclear strike on Iran. It's that if he did that, and if he knew he did not have the backing of the American people, he's obviously risking impeachment for something like that if the people grossly
now let's discuss
disagree.
that. I mean, so impeaching a president, I guess what I'm saying is, it seems to me that we've had an undeclared war. 9/11 is upon us. So for 12 years ago, we had this horrific, horrible thing that everybody can remember where they were when it happened, how horrible it was. And so for the past 12 years, all kinds of events have occurred. I mean, there have been violations of civil liberties in regards to the government prowling and prying, etc., on your private communications. The government has killed American citizens. Also, the government has fought, really, in Afghanistan and Iraq, tremendous war, what I'd call a war. $1 trillion of national treasure has gone away, and in the middle of all this, all kinds of cruel, terrible things have happened, because that's what war is. I mean, our drone strikes have killed lots of children. I've heard several hundred children have been killed just on these drone strikes. Cluster bombs are used. All these. This is what war is. Thousands of people have been killed in an undeclared fashion. I mean, isn't it time to? And seemingly, this war is stretching into perpetuity. Isn't it time to define how we manage this? What kind of constitutional control we have over war? Any thoughts about that?
Well, this is something that Congress has tried to do in the past. One of the biggest and certainly one of the least popular undeclared wars we fought was Vietnam. If you consider that we have not actually formally declared war since Pearl Harbor, all these wars have been undeclared. Congress did pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964. It wasn't a declaration of war. Congress was shirking its duty. In that resolution...
Is that unusual?
Oh, yes, well, Congress passed a resolution saying we empower the President to do what he thinks best to preserve American interests in Southeast Asia. And then after the debacle that followed in '73, Congress rescinded the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and passed the War Powers Resolution. And Nixon vetoed it, and Congress promptly overrode the veto, and no president, to my knowledge, has conceded the constitutionality of that resolution since. But it's an attempt to do exactly what you're talking about, to rein in the commander-in-chief power of the president that has grown so much simply because of speed and of firepower these days. It says if the president commits troops to combat, he's got to tell Congress immediately. If Congress takes no action, the president's required to withdraw those troops at the end of 60 or 90 days. And
well, a lot can happen in 60 to 90 days.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Lots of things. Lots of things.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sort of not happy with this constitutional arrangement. It seems to me there should be some kind of improvement about the way these things occur. Now, allegedly, one of the things that happens with Congress is that they have some kind of access to American policy and oversees actions through different committees, oversight committees.
Foreign intelligence, for instance, and military affairs oversight, this sort of thing.
Now, the question that I ask is, if the executive really wants to be aggressive for whatever reason, and he wants to slight Congress, he doesn't really have to tell Congress what's going on. There might be an oversight committee, true enough, but isn't this like a de facto grand jury? I mean, when the people are in there, they just get one story, the administration. Do they have the ability to basically say, wait a second, I want this, I want that, I want this, I want sort of essentially a defense attorney or a prosecutor to, I want to hear the total other side about what's going on, particularly as we looked at what transpired in the I guess you'd call it the Second Gulf War, when we had this wrong information was propagated. Is the system functional, I guess is my question.
Well, it's functional, but in many ways it is a system that was designed with 18th century warfare in mind. Congress does have the investigative authority. That's a power that's inherent to Congress. It has the power to summon witnesses, to subpoena. It has the power to punish for contempt. There's actually a jail in the Capitol building that hasn't been used.
Now, hasn't
for
that
ages,
happened?
but,
I think with the Attorney General, wasn't he
cited for contempt?
And then what happened?
Sails right along merrily.
So nothing happened.
Yes.
So what I'm getting into, I guess, is we have this complicated world. We have this enormous arsenal of power that the country possesses, and it's under the purview of the president. And it's seemingly the president has got a lot of leeway to do whatever he wants, and it really is a little spooky.
Yes.
Is that a fair statement?
Well, it is. But once again, historically, several things are, in terms of history and human nature, several things are going on. As we got to the point of high-speed weapons and high-powered weapons and nuclear weapons and chemical nerve agents, this is exactly the same time the Cold War was beginning to heat up. And so everybody wanted the president to have this leeway to deal with this imminent threat. So it was okay for many years. Many people saw it. So Congress willingly sort of abrogated its own responsibility and shoved it onto the shoulders of the president. And Congress found it liked that. It was better for the president to take the political heat. So yes, Congress can punish for contempt. Will Congress do it is the big question. Of course, Congress doesn't want to have to take a stand like that. So Congress has really not flexed the muscles it could be flexing in terms of investigating and in terms of being proactive with the president. It's just easier for it to criticize the president from the sidelines.
Well, let's talk about war crimes. Let's suppose that just a situation exists where the president says to someone, well, I want you to just blow up a town. We're just going to blow. There are lots of civilians there. Let's just knock that town off.
Yes.
And there just happens to be 12,000 civilians in the town. There's small children. There's a maternity hospital there. 12,000 people are killed, and the people that do this in the military, they're getting ready to do it. They've got something that comes from the presidents to do this. And supposedly it's
they're only following orders.
It's under the color of the way the courts have construed the Constitution.
Yes.
So if that occurred, I mean, is there international law that would trump what occurred here? I mean, presumably one of the things that we're talking about now is the quote the New World Order, where people in other countries can be guilty of war crimes. I mean, if you use poison gas, that's a war crime. All right, they killed 400 children. But if we use drone strikes and we killed a lot of children, that would be okay or whatever. I mean, that's war. Yeah. And so the selective enforcement, what about that? What about The Hague? What about the ability, is our system have the chance that an abuse of power could cause immoral actions?
Well, I think there's a narrow answer to your question and there's a broad answer. The narrow answer raises the question of whether international law is somehow incorporated by the Constitution to become a part of municipal law. And so that Congress could then say to the president, you have violated certain principles of international law, either the Hague Convention or the Geneva Conventions, and because you have done that, violating international law principles constitute an impeachable offense. And there's been debate over that for at least 100 years as to whether or not international law is somehow enforceable in municipal courts. The broader issue is the idea of restraint by systems of law. John Adams I'm a great hero, a great fan of his. He's a great hero in American history, and he's one of the ones who put forward this idea of a government of laws and not of men. And it's a wonderful sentiment, but ultimately, if men are in the driver's seat and they don't want to obey the laws, what can you do about it? If the president wants to nuke 20,000 civilians, and he does not feel any sense of loyalty to either a municipal or an international law system, what can you do about that except throw him out after the fact?
Well, what about the people that did it? In other words, they were following orders. It's sort of a delicate question to ask. So if the concept exists, that there's some, which sounds reasonable to me, I'm not against it. The idea that if you're a real bad guy, you just can't use poison, you just can't take poison gas and kill 50,000 people. And if you did that, you're number one, you're guilty of war crimes, and all the people that served under you that did that are going to be guilty of war crimes, and you're going to The Hague. And that's sort of what happened in Bosnia. I mean, these terrible atrocities occurred. So so it seems like once you accept the idea, there's some kind of international tribune that will do this. Doesn't that ergo mean that the U.S. and thus the American president is potentially has the responsibility not to commit war crimes, and the people that serve in the military could presumably find themselves at The Hague, or do we have special dispensation?
Well, once again, it's more a question of politics instead of law. For instance, if you look at the war crime trials after World War II of the Nazis and of the Japanese, there was no real solid international law principle in effect there that they had violated.
Yes.
We had to make up these principles of justice, crimes against humanity and war crimes and this sort of thing. And Curtis LeMay, who had so effectively bombed Japan into cinders, actually admitted after the war, he said, did it worry him? He said, no. He said, if we had lost the war, I would probably be tried for war crimes.
Yes.
It's like there's no such thing as a successful treason. You know, the winners, winners are immune in a sense.
Right now,
so
it's what I'm getting into is, and I'm not saying this is bad, but the idea of some kind of higher law in our world,
Yes.
where people just can't commit atrocities. And seemingly, what's going on is that the president is saying, I'm going to independently enforce this higher moral law that does not necessarily comport with a narrow view of American self-interest. I mean, everybody wants a moral world, all
Yes.
right, but it doesn't really make the, I don't know, the price of petroleum go up or down, or maybe it makes it even worse. It might actually be against the economic interests of the country. But can Congress say, or is it appropriate for Congress to say, you know, this is an undeclared war for hazy humanitarian purposes, and it could blunder if the case were put there. Then presumably what could happen is if the U.S. were doing something, let's say we're using drone strikes, is it fair for Russia to attack the U.S., try and blow up Washington to stop the drone strikes? Because seemingly the U.S. has announced they have an independent moral arbitrator of the world. Any country could do that.
But that's different. We're America.
Yes.
And that's really I think that's the stunned reaction you would get from Washington. A non sequitur, something that doesn't matter. It really is who has the biggest club. And that's one reason that we see ourselves as the world policeman in the sense of American exceptionalism, that it's different for us because we can do it. And we don't really conceive of the idea of coming in and stopping us. But it does cut both ways. The idea of the natural law, these human rights principles, they're either universal or they're not.
Yes.
And you know, if you're operating out of higher morality, you're going to have to be judged by that higher morality as well. And that's something we like to conveniently ignore.
Yes.
But if China decided it needed to send in peacekeeping troops
Right.
into San Francisco to make sure its nationals were being treated fairly, you know, the reaction you would get from America is just, we're stunned.
Now, is this some of the international debate that's going on? I mean, it seems to me it's a complicated question. Nobody wants children to be killed. This guy, you know, we see some bad people out there. We've certainly seen a number of them in the Middle East. I mean, you can just look at those horrible people we've dealt with. And is it an appropriate use of national power under these circumstances to enforce at least what seems to be some kind of moral covenant that we ourselves could be guilty of not observing?
Yeah, I think the first step is to ask, can it do any good? Can it change anything? And then if the answer to that is yes, then what is the chance and how much will it cost? And what might be the price, and not just in terms of money, but for instance, in the case of Syria, chemical weapons are cheap to make, they're hard to find, they're easy to import. So if we carry out a cruise missile strike, are we opening ourselves up to sarin attacks in New York subways? I think there would be an excellent chance that would happen.
Well, what about international law? I mean, the idea is what we've done. I mean, we have presumably, there hasn't been any groundswell against this as we're fighting this sort of undeclared war. So in the Arabian Peninsula, in Yemen or wherever, we'll just send some cruise missiles in, we'll kill people, we'll go into Sudan, we'll do this, we'll just exercise force. In Libya, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll go into Lebanon, we'll go into Iran, we'll just do whatever we want to, really, if we perceive it being a moral thing to do.
Yes.
But isn't that like a declaration of war? Would it be fair if we attack the Syrians, that they say, the president goes before his parliament, I declare war on the U.S., I mean, and we're going to do whatever we can, it's a state of war. I mean, would that be reasonable? And what does international law say about that? Could Syria just go to the United Nations and say, we've been attacked by another country here?
Well, there could,
and we want the UN to fight America because we were attacked by them.
Yes. Well, the UN Charter pretty clearly speaks against this idea of preventative war. That the only time you can really safely declare war is to defend yourself, to ward off either an actual invasion or a potential invasion, preemptive war. But international law is a difficult thing. International law is based very much on what states actually do and how they actually conduct themselves. And a lot of times that's not based on morality. It's not based on a higher law, because if you ask Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims and Taoists and Protestant Christians and Catholic Christians to come up with universal principles of moral law, they're all going to have disagreements with each other. So whose moral law? That presents a huge problem of policing and of determining right and wrong and that sort of thing.
Well, now, aren't we, I mean, this is a conversation about ethics, morality,
Yes.
and law, and that's an appropriate, to me, that seems like what this crisis in Syria that's what should happen,
Mm-hmm.
and we should get past sort of the narrow political joustings that occur. I mean, it's an important question, isn't
Mm-hmm.
it? If you look at our planet, 10 billion people here by 2050, huge population increases, a huge shift in the world's power. I mean, the American power, you could make the percentage of the GNP that our country has is diminished, this and that, the amount of money that we have to do things. We have this internal extraordinary debt crisis. There's huge shifts that are going on, and the countries that are becoming more powerful seem to have different ethical principles than we do.
Yes.
So and when that happens, I mean, don't we wind up in some tremendous terrible terminal world dispute? I mean, do we have to seek some kind of international guidelines about what's the appropriate use of force, for what circumstances? I mean, any
Yes.
thoughts about that?
Well, that's, the world at large has been trying to do that for at least 100 years. If you push back to the early Hague conferences around the turn of the 20th century, those tended to be Eurocentric.
Yes.
Because the third world had not really
Yes,
emerged as a
yes,
force yet.
yes.
Adding the third world to it complicates the issue because you do have these different perspectives of different ethical traditions and different religions. And you also have the additional complication that's been added of modern weaponry that small groups or individuals can wield a power that is grossly disproportionate to their numbers. And sarin nerve gas is one of the best examples of all that. The Aum Shinrikyo cult, the nerve gassing of the Tokyo subways. We're just going to see more and more of that, and there's no easy answer to it, unfortunately.
Well, Bucky, as the title of the show goes, observations. Let's
Yes.
continue to observe and make comments. So
Indeed,
thank you
observe and
so
learn.
much for being
Thank
here.
you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks.